I want you to stop what you're doing. Just for a moment. Stop scrolling. Stop moving. Just be still. Now I want you to listen. Not to me. Not yet. Listen to your surroundings. The room you're in right now. Whatever sounds exist in this moment. The hum of appliances. The wind outside. Traffic in the distance. Listen to all of it. Now. Is there anything you can't explain? A creak that comes from the same place every night. A sound behind a wall that you've always told yourself is just the pipes. A feeling. Not quite a sound. Not quite a sig. Just a feeling that something in the room is slightly different from how you left it. Most people have a moment like that. Most people dismiss it immediately. Clara Mews dismissed it too, for 11 days. This is her story, and I promise you, by the time I'm finished, you will never dismiss that feeling again. Welcome to Dark Mystery Stories. I'm glad you're here. Try to stay calm. To understand what happened to Clara Mews, you first need to understand Millhaven, Georgia. It was the kind of town that existed in thousands of places across America in the 1980s, small enough that everyone knew your car, your family name, and roughly what time you went to bed at night. Big enough that strangers could pass through without causing much of a stir. Population, just under 4,000 people. One main street with a diner, a hardware store, a pharmacy, and a barber shop that had been owned by the same family since 1931. Surrounding it, miles and miles of Georgia pine forest, red clay roads that turned to mud in the rain, and houses spaced far enough apart that a person could scream at full volume and not be entirely certain anyone would hear. It was a quiet town, a safe town, the kind of place where people left their back doors unlocked and their children played outside until the street lights came on. Nobody in Millhaven locked their doors at night. Not until 1987. Clara Mews had grown up 3 hours north of Millhaven in Atlanta, where she had spent the first 26 years of her life doing all the things a person is supposed to do. She went to college. She got a job at a marketing firm downtown. She married a man named David, who was charming in the way that warning signs sometimes are, compelling right up until the moment they become impossible to ignore. The divorce was finalized in August 1987. It was not ugly, as divorces go. It was something arguably worse. It was quiet, clinical. Two people sitting across a table from each other, dividing a life into boxes, and realizing somewhere in the middle of the process that neither of them was particularly devastated. That was the part that scared Clara most. Not the loss, but the absence of loss. She decided she needed to go somewhere she had never been. Somewhere no one knew her name or her history, or the particular way her marriage had simply run out of steam. A colleague mentioned Millhaven, said it was peaceful, said the rent was cheap and the people were kind, and the forests were beautiful in the fall. Clara drove down on a Saturday in early September. She found Hollow Creek Road by accident, took a wrong turn off the main highway, and came around a bend in the trees to find herself facing a long gravel driveway lined with ancient oak trees, their branches arching overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. At the end of the driveway sat the house. She stopped the car. She sat for a moment, looking at it through the windshield, and despite every instinct that she would later spend years trying to understand, she felt immediately, profoundly at home. The house had been built in 1923, according to county records, a 2-story colonial in the old Southern style, wide front porch, tall, narrow windows, white clapboard siding that had been repainted so many times, the wood beneath was more paint than timber. There were 6 rooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, 2 bedrooms upstairs, one of which Clara immediately designated as a study, a bathroom that still had its original clawfoot tub, stained faintly at the drain, and a basement, low-ceilinged, earthen-floored, accessible through a door in the kitchen that stuck in its frame and required a firm shoulder to open. Clara looked into the basement once during the viewing, shone a flashlight down the stairs, and decided she would use it for nothing more than storing the boxes she hadn't finished unpacking. The landlord, Mr. Harold Hale, 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher with a careful, methodical way of speaking, met her at the front door with a ring of old keys and a handshake that lasted slightly too long. He walked her through the house efficiently. Not unpleasantly. He was courteous, answered her questions clearly, pointed out the boiler and the fuse box, and the spot in the upstairs hallway where the floorboard tended to splinter if you stepped on it wrong. But he moved quickly. The way a person moves through a place they don't like to spend too much time. He never opened any of the closets. Later, Clara would remember this and understand it for what it was. But at the time, she simply noticed it as a small eccentricity, the way old men sometimes have small eccentricities. "How long has the house been available?" she asked, as they stood on the front porch and she signed the lease. "A few months," Mr. Hale said. "And the previous tenant?" A pause, brief, nearly imperceptible. "She moved on," he said. "People always do, eventually." He said it with a slight emphasis on the word always that Clara found oddly reassuring at the time. She handed back the pen. She took the keys, and Harold Hale walked to his truck, drove to the end of the driveway, and turned onto Hollow Creek Road without once looking back at the house. Clara moved in the following Friday. The first week was genuinely uncomplicated, peacefully normal. She unpacked her books and arranged them on shelves she found in the garage. She bought a second-hand armchair from a shop on the main street and positioned it beside the sitting room fireplace. She learned which grocery store had the best produce, which diner had the best coffee, and which road to take to avoid school traffic on weekday mornings. She began sleeping better than she had in years. The house was quiet in a way that Atlanta never had been. A deep layered country quiet, full of crickets and distant owls and the low percussion of wind through pine trees. After years of city noise, it felt like being submerged in something cool and still. She called her sister on the Wednesday of the first week. "How's the house?" her sister asked. "Perfect," Clara said. She was sitting on the front porch in the late afternoon light, watching the oak trees turn gold. "It's exactly what I needed."
I feel completely
"Do you feel safe out there? It sounds very isolated."
I think that's why I like
"I feel
it here."
completely safe," Clara said. "I think that's why I like it." Her sister told her she was glad, and Clara meant every word of it. For 7 more days, she meant every word of it. It started on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of October. Clara had been asleep for perhaps an hour when something pulled her up through the layers of sleep. Not a loud noise, not a crash or a cry, but something quieter and more insidious than that. A presence in the sound of the room. An addition. She lay still with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and within 30 seconds, she identified it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Perfectly rhythmic. It was not her own. It was coming from the wall to the left of her bed, the interior wall that separated the bedroom from the upstairs hallway. Clara sat up slowly, turned on the bedside lamp, looked at the wall. Cream-coloured paint, a small water stain near the ceiling from some long-ago leak, a framed print she had hung on her second day, a botanical illustration of wild flowers she had always loved. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. She sat in the lamplight and listened for 4 full minutes. Silence, just the house settling, just the wind, just the ordinary acoustics of an old building in the small hours of the morning. She turned off the lamp, lay back down, closed her eyes, pause. 40 seconds later, it returned. Slow, deep, from inside the wall. She lay rigid in the darkness for a very long time, constructing an explanation. Old houses had pipes that ran behind the walls. Those pipes expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. Sometimes they made unusual sounds, rhythmic sounds, almost organic sounds. This was a well-documented phenomenon. There was nothing strange about it. She believed this completely. She went back to sleep just before 4 in the morning, with the breathing still moving softly through the wall beside her head. She heard it again on Wednesday night, and Thursday, and Friday. By Saturday, she had developed a routine: lie awake for 20 minutes or so, listen to the breathing until she became almost accustomed to it, construct her pipe theory firmly in her mind, and drift back off to sleep. It was the coping mechanism of a rational, intelligent woman who did not yet have access to the information she needed to make a different choice. Pause. She would spend years afterward replaying those nights, those 20-minute windows of lying in the dark, staring at the wall, 3 inches of drywall and insulation separating her from something she had no framework to understand. She would think about what she had known and chosen not to examine. She would think about the breathing. And she would think about how, in those early weeks, it had sometimes seemed almost companionable, the way you might feel, sleeping in a house where someone else is also awake in another room. The specific quality of not being entirely alone. Long pause. She would never forgive herself for finding it comforting. It was a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she had first heard the breathing. The sky outside was low and white, that particular flat October light that turns everything the colour of old paper. Clara was making her bed, pulling the fitted sheet tight at the corners, smoothing the duvet, when she stopped. She was on the left side of the bed, the side closest to the interior wall, and she was looking at something she had somehow not noticed before. A hole in the wall. Small. Circular. Perhaps the diameter of a large coin, located at a height of approximately 4 feet from the floor, which was, she realized with a cold and crawling slowness, exactly level with where her eyes were when she was lying down. She stood absolutely still for a long time, looking at it. Then she crossed to her dresser and picked up the framed photograph that sat there, herself and her younger sister on a beach in Florida, the summer of 1985. Both of them laughing at something off camera, squinting into the white Atlantic sun. She carried it to the wall. She pressed the frame flat against the paint, covering the hole completely. She held it there for a moment, as if making sure it would stay. Then she went downstairs, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for a very long time, without drinking it. She went to work. She taught herself not to think about it. She came home at 6, cooked dinner, watched television, and went to bed. The photograph was where she had left it. She slept. In the morning, she got up, showered, and went downstairs to start the coffee maker. Came back upstairs to get dressed, and stopped in the bedroom doorway. The photograph was on the floor. Not fallen, the nail was still in the wall. The hanging wire on the back of the frame was intact, undamaged. The photograph had been removed from the nail, carefully, and set flat on the floor, face up, directly below where it had hung. From the inside of the wall, very long pause, Clara stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at the photograph on the floor for what she would later estimate was approximately 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, her mind moved through a series of explanations with the desperate efficiency of a person who is not yet willing to arrive at the truth. Vibrations. The photograph had been loosened by vibrations. A passing truck, a slight tremor. Air pressure. A draft from somewhere had, somehow, dislodged it. She had not placed it properly on the nail, and gravity had done the rest. She considered each of these explanations in turn, and one by one, she felt them dissolve, because there was one thing she could not explain away. The photograph had not fallen. It had been placed, face up, centered, with a precision and a deliberateness that no accident could account for. Someone had taken it off the nail. Someone had set it down. Someone, at some point in the night, had reached through the hole in the wall and moved it. She called Mark Hollis at 8:45 that morning. Mark was her oldest friend. They had grown up 3 streets apart in Atlanta, had known each other since they were 7 years old. He was a contractor now. Practical, unflappable, the kind of man who approached problems the way a surgeon approaches an operating table, calmly, methodically, without drama. She told him she thought she had a problem with rats in the walls. She didn't mention the breathing. She didn't mention the hole. She didn't mention the photograph. Even then, even at that point, with all she had seen and heard, she found herself editing the story, making it smaller, more manageable, more the kind of thing a person could say out loud without sounding like they were losing their mind. Mark said he'd come over that evening. He arrived at 9:30 with a heavy flashlight, a crowbar, and a bag of tools, wearing the same easy expression he always wore, as if this were any other job. They started in the upstairs hallway, where Clara had noticed the wall sounded most hollow when you knocked on it. A flat, resonant emptiness, like knocking on the lid of a box. Mark pressed his palm flat against the drywall, knocked with his knuckles, listened, moved 6 inches, knocked again. "Yeah," he said. "That's hollow all right. Much more than it should be." He looked at Clara. She nodded. He raised the crowbar, swung it once, hard, into the wall. The drywall cracked open like an eggshell, and a smell rolled out of the gap. Stale air, old fabric, something faintly organic and warm that Clara would spend years trying to find words for. Mark shone the flashlight into the gap, and then he went very still. Behind the wall was a crawl space, roughly 18 inches wide, narrow enough that a grown adult would need to turn sideways to stand in it comfortably. It ran in both directions along the length of the house, disappearing into darkness to the left and to the right, extending far beyond what the flashlight beam could reach. The floor of the crawl space was not bare. Mark moved the flashlight slowly across what lay inside. A sleeping mat, long and thin, compressed flat with years of use, a slight concave depression worn into its center in the unmistakable shape of a human body. Beside it, a water jug, 2-gallon, plastic, yellowed with age, 3 tin cans of food, stacked neatly against the inner wall, several more open and emptied, arranged in a separate pile, a small battery-powered lantern, the batteries long dead, a bundle of clothing, folded with extraordinary precision, each item pressed flat and aligned at the edges, the way a person folds things when they have nothing but time and silence and the need to impose order on a very small space. A paperback novel, its spine cracked, its pages soft with handling, a tin cup, a plastic fork, and in the far corner, half hidden under the edge of the sleeping mat, a shoebox. Mark and Clara looked at each other. Neither of them spoke. Mark reached the crowbar into the space and carefully dragged the shoebox toward the gap. He lifted the lid. Long pause. Inside the shoebox were photographs. He spread them in the beam of the flashlight. There were at least 60. Possibly more. All of Clara. Clara in her bedroom, asleep. The covers pulled to her chin, taken from the hole in the wall. Clara at her kitchen table in the morning with her coffee, taken through a small gap between the kitchen baseboard and the floor. Clara in the sitting room, reading, her feet tucked underneath her, taken through a crack in the fireplace wall. Clara on the phone, on the porch, at her desk in the study. The photographs were printed. Physical prints, not digital. This was 1987. Every image carefully developed. They were dated on the back in a small, precise handwriting. They began on the day Clara moved in, and they continued. 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 per day, right up to the previous Thursday. Pause. Mark set the photographs down very carefully. He stood up. He turned to Clara, and in a voice that was completely, deliberately steady, he said, "We need to call the police right now." 3 patrol cars arrived within 15 minutes. By midnight, there were 7 officers in the house and a detective named Ray Calhoun who would lead the investigation for the next 3 days. What they found inside the walls of that house over the course of 72 hours would, years later, be described by Detective Calhoun in a true crime interview as the most disturbing thing he encountered in 31 years of law enforcement. Not because of violence. There had been no violence. But because of the sheer, meticulous, patient architecture of it. The crawl spaces ran throughout the entire house, not just the upstairs hallway, but behind every interior wall on both floors, accessible through a series of small, carefully constructed passages that connected each section to the next. Whoever had built this system had not done so hastily. They had done it over a very long period of time, working slowly, silently, in the deep hours of the night, removing and replacing sections of wall with a precision that left almost no visible trace from the outside. They had modified the plumbing. There was a tap, a small handheld spigot installed in one section of the crawl space that connected to the main water line. Whoever had lived here had access to running water. They had modified the electrical wiring. A single outlet, hidden in the deepest section of the space, provided access to the house's power supply. They had, over what appeared to be many years, installed ventilation. Small, nearly invisible perforations in the exterior siding, positioned to allow airflow without being detectable from outside. And throughout the entire system, at regular intervals, at the precise height required to look into every room in the house, there were holes. Small, circular, rimmed with what appeared to be a thin metal eyelet, installed with care, designed to be covered from the other side by whatever ordinary object was closest. A picture frame, a light switch plate, a crack in the skirting board, observation points, every room in the house, every angle of every room. There was nowhere in that house that could not be watched. Pause. The investigators found food wrappers dating back, based on product packaging and discontinuation dates, as far as the mid-1970s. They found clothing in sizes suggesting a single adult male, medium build. They found personal effects, a worn leather wallet with no identification inside, a small hand mirror, a toothbrush worn to almost nothing. They found, in one section of the space, what appeared to be a small collection of objects taken from the house's various tenants over the years. Small things, a button, a bookmark, a dried flower, a child's drawing, keepsakes. Long pause. The tenant before Clara had been a woman named Patricia Greer, who had lived in the house for 14 months before leaving suddenly and, by all accounts, without adequate explanation. She had told friends she found the house unsettling, that she had trouble sleeping, that she felt, persistently and inexplicably, like she was being watched. She had put it down to anxiety. She had never told anyone about the sounds in the walls. Before Patricia Greer, there had been a family, a couple with 2 young children, who had lived in the house for nearly 3 years in the early 1980s. The husband had complained to Harold Hale on several occasions about sounds in the walls at night. Hale had sent a pest control company. The pest control company found nothing. Before them, the house records became more difficult to trace. But based on what they found inside those walls, the layers of accumulated living, the objects, the food wrappers, the worn-down impressions in every sleeping surface, Detective Calhoun's estimate was conservative. He believed someone had been living inside the walls of that house for no fewer than 20 years, possibly longer. Pause. Harold Hale was brought in for questioning on the second day. He was cooperative. He was distressed. He was, by all accounts, genuinely horrified. He told investigators that he had purchased the house in 1979 from a man who had subsequently died, with no living relatives and no estate to speak of. He told them he had noticed unusual sounds in the house during the time it was vacant between tenants, sounds he had attributed to wildlife, to the age of the building, to his own imagination. He told them he had never, not once, considered the possibility of a person. He was never charged with any offence. Whether or not he told investigators everything he knew is a question that was never fully resolved. On the morning of the third day, with the search winding down and no suspect in custody and no real prospect of one, Detective Ray Calhoun sat down with Clara on the front porch steps. It was early. The sun was just coming through the oak trees, cutting long gold lines across the red clay driveway. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the branches, the kind of morning that had no business being beautiful. Calhoun was a lean, quiet man in his late 40s, with the permanent slight squint of someone who spent a lot of time looking at things he didn't want to see. He had barely slept in 3 days. He held a cup of coffee in both hands and looked at the trees for a while before he spoke. "I've been doing this job for 19 years, he said eventually. "I've worked homicides, kidnappings, things that most people never have to know exist." He paused. "This is the one that's going to stay with me." Clara waited. "Not because of what he did," Calhoun said. "He didn't hurt anyone, not physically, not directly." Another pause. "It's because of what it tells you about a person. What kind of person can do this? Can live this way? Can reduce themselves to existing in the gaps of someone else's life? For years. Decades." He shook his head slowly. "What do you call that? What is that?" Clara didn't have an answer. Calhoun set down his coffee cup. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She nodded. "He didn't break in. There's no evidence of forced entry at any point during your tenancy. No locks tampered with. No windows compromised." He looked at her. "We believe he was already inside the house when you moved in." Clara held his gaze. "We believe he was already inside when the tenant before you moved in." Pause. "Our best estimate, based on the physical evidence inside those walls, the food, the objects, the wear patterns on the sleeping surfaces, is that this individual has been living in this house for somewhere between 20 and 25 years." The mockingbird kept singing. The sunlight moved through the oak trees. "We don't know his name," Calhoun said. "We have no fingerprint matches in any database we've been able to access. We have no missing persons report that fits the physical profile. We have, effectively, no leads. He stood, picked up his hat. We may never identify him, he said. I think you should be prepared for that. He looked at her one more time. The look of a man who has just handed someone a weight they will carry for the rest of their life and knows it. I'm sorry, he said. I truly am. He walked to his car. He didn't look back at the house either. Clara left Millhaven the following morning. She drove back to Atlanta in 4 hours, went to her sister's house, and didn't speak about what had happened for nearly 9 years. When she finally told her story to a journalist named David Ferris, who was researching a book about unusual criminal cases in the rural American South, she was 35 years old, remarried, living in a house she had personally renovated from the ground up, with every wall stripped to the studs before she moved a single piece of furniture in. Ferris asked her what the worst part had been. She thought about it for a long time before she answered. People expect me to say the photographs, she said, or finding out how long it had been going on, or knowing he was 3 inches away from me while I slept. She looked at her hands. But it was the clothes. Ferris waited. The folded clothes, she said, in that bundle in the corner. Every item folded so precisely, so carefully. The creases were perfect. She paused. You can learn to fold like that when you have nothing to do but be still and quiet and invisible for 20 years, when your whole existence is about taking up as little space as possible, about making no impression, leaving no trace. She looked up. He had been living inside other people's lives for so long that he had completely ceased to exist in his own. He wasn't a person anymore, he was just a presence, a watching, a breathing in the walls. Pause. And the thing that I still can't get past, even now, even after all these years, is that I felt it. I felt him there. Some part of me knew something was wrong from the very first night. And I told myself it was pipes. Long pause. The house on Hollow Creek Road was condemned by Millhaven County in the spring of 1988. The demolition was scheduled for October of that year, exactly 1 year after Clara had first heard the breathing. A crew of 5 men arrived at dawn on a Tuesday morning with heavy equipment and a work order and absolutely no knowledge of the history of the building they were there to tear down. They had been working for about 2 hours when one of them, a young man named Eddie Pruitt, 19 years old, on only his 3rd week with the crew, went to relieve himself behind what remained of the back wall. He almost stepped on them before he saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. In the red Georgia clay, still soft from the rain the night before, leading out of a gap in the demolished wall where the crawl space had been exposed by the wrecking equipment, crossing the backyard in a straight, deliberate line, disappearing into the tree line at the edge of the property. Eddie stood there for a long time, looking at those footprints. Then he went and got his foreman. The foreman called the police. Calhoun, still on the force, still carrying the case in whatever way a detective carries the cases that never close, drove out within the hour. He followed the footprints to the edge of the woods. At the tree line, the ground hardened and the footprints ended. He searched the forest with 2 other officers until it was too dark to see. They found nothing. No person, no camp, no further trace. Calhoun stood at the tree line as the last light went out of the sky and looked into the darkness of the Georgia pines. He thought about 20 years. He thought about what kind of person lives in walls for 20 years. He thought about where such a person goes when the walls come down. He never found out. The case was never closed. The man was never identified, and if he is still alive today, he would be somewhere in his 60s, maybe older. He would be very quiet, very still, very good at going unnoticed. And he would be somewhere with walls. Tonight, when you go to bed, and the house settles around you, and the sounds begin, the ones you've always had a name for, I want you to lie still for a moment and listen. Really listen. Not to the sounds you can explain, to the ones you can't. Because here is the thing about this story that no one talks about. He was never caught. He was never identified. He simply moved on. People always do. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. If this story reached something in you, if it followed you here from the beginning and it's still sitting with you now, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Dark Mystery Stories. Leave a comment below telling me what sound in your house you've never been able to explain. I read every single one. New darkness drops every week, and we will be here, waiting. Good night. Check your walls.